Where is he? The leader of a nation at war, a man whose face is known across the globe, has seemingly vanished from the map. His bunker's empty, his office is damaged, and rumors swirling from Washington to Tehran about whether the man responsible for directing one of the most consequential military conflicts in the modern Middle East is hiding, running, or simply trying to survive long enough to see its conclusion. Tonight, the world is asking one question. Where is Benjamin Netanyahu? Welcome back to the Global Audit YouTube channel, bringing you the latest global updates. It is a question that sounds like the plot of a political thriller, but for a former senior United States military official, it is not fiction. It is a strategic reality being lived out in real time above the skies of a region that has been transformed by weeks of sustained conflict into one of the most dangerous operational environments on the planet. In a candid interview that has sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, retired Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who once served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, and who spent decades inside the architecture of American military and foreign policy, painted a startling picture of the Israeli Prime Minister's wartime routine that reveals just how dramatically the nature of this conflict has shifted the calculations of even the most powerful leaders in the region. When a reporter pressed him on Netanyahu's extended absence from the public eye, Wilkerson's response was chillingly simple and strategically precise. He revealed that Prime Minister is estimated to spend approximately 90% of his time in the air, on a plane, a ghost in the sky, moving constantly between locations, never remaining stationary on the ground long enough to become a fixed target, ruling the war from 35,000 feet, and staying connected to Israel's war room through encrypted satellite communication links, while the landscape below is being systematically torn apart by the most intense missile campaign Israel has faced in its history. This is not paranoia, and it is not theater. It is the calculated survival strategy of a head of government who understands that in the new architecture of precision warfare, a stationary leader is a vulnerable leader, and a vulnerable leader is a potential strategic target that an adversary will not hesitate to exploit. The logic becomes even clearer when you understand what happened in the opening hours of the conflict with Iran, when Netanyahu's own office complex was directly targeted in a strike that underscored a fundamental limitation of even the most sophisticated missile defense architecture ever built. That while Israel's Iron Dome, Arrow, and David Sling systems are specifically engineered to protect population centers and critical infrastructure from large-scale missile attacks, they cannot guarantee the physical safety of a single stationary individual whose location, once identified, becomes a target that can be approached from angles and with weapons that no layered defense system was designed to address. So the leader becomes a moving target, a modern-day nomad conducting the business of wartime governance from the confined space of an aircraft cabin, his decisions shaping events on the ground while he himself never touches that ground long enough to be found. The same retired U.S. colonel offered a blunt and unvarnished assessment of the situation on the ground in Israel's commercial and cultural heartland when asked directly about the damage being sustained in Tel Aviv, and his answer, stripped of diplomatic language, was stark and unambiguous. The city is taking a pounding that is described as relentless and grinding, a sustained campaign that has moved far beyond the sanitized imagery of precision strikes that military briefings and official communications typically present to the public. Iran's operational strategy in this conflict has not been to achieve one decisive blow. It has been to execute what military analysts describe as saturation campaign, deliberately designed to overwhelm Israel's interceptor batteries by launching volumes of missiles and drones that exceed the physical capacity of any defense system to neutralize simultaneously, exhausting the stockpiles of interceptor missiles that cost between $40,000 and $3 million per unit, depending on the system, and allowing enough projectiles through the defensive perimeter to sustain a continuous psychological and physical pressure on a population that has been living under sirens and shelter-in-place orders for weeks. This is the new mathematics of asymmetric warfare, and the equation is becoming increasingly difficult for the defending side to resolve, because each Iranian missile or drone, while representing sophisticated engineering, costs a fraction of the high-technology American and Israeli interceptors required to destroy it in flight. And those interceptor stockpiles are finite resources that cannot be replenished at the speed they are being consumed. The United States has been shipping emergency interceptor resupply packages to Israel throughout the conflict, but the production capacity of American defense manufacturers, even operating at elevated output, cannot match the consumption rate being imposed by Iran's sustained saturation strategy. And every defense analyst tracking this conflict understands that the trajectory of stockpile depletion is one of the most consequential variables determining how this conflict ultimately resolves. But the war is not being fought solely over Israeli cities, and America, Israel's superpower ally, and the country whose military assets, bases, and personnel are distributed across the region in numbers that make it an unavoidable participant, regardless of its formal declarations, is feeling the direct consequences in ways that have fundamentally altered the strategic calculus in Washington. In a development that has been confirmed by American media and that sent a visible shock through Western defense establishments, Iran has demonstrated a precision capability that many military planners had assessed as unlikely given the defensive measures in place. It has effectively blinded one of the United States military's most prized and expensive defensive assets in the region. At the Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, the United States had stationed what represented the crown jewel of its forward-deployed air defense architecture, a THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, battery equipped with its AN by TPY-2 radar, a massive football field-sized sensor array that represents one of the most advanced ballistic missile detection systems ever built, capable of detecting and tracking incoming ballistic missiles from hundreds of miles away, providing the critical early warning data that feeds the entire regional defense network. Its replacement cost is approximately $500 million, and its strategic value to the regional defense architecture is incalculable. In a strike that satellite imagery has since confirmed, Iran executed a precision attack that destroyed the primary sensor array, a surgical, devastating blow that simultaneously degraded American defensive capability, demonstrated Iranian intelligence on the locations of protected assets, and sent an unmistakable message to every government in the region about the limits of the shield that American military power can realistically provide. For weeks, the United States had been reinforcing its regional bases with THAAD and Patriot missile batteries, constructing what was intended to be an invisible defensive shield over American assets and allied infrastructure across the Gulf. And Iran has now demonstrated, with documented and satellite-confirmed evidence, that this shield has exploitable vulnerabilities that Iranian military planners have clearly identified, mapped, and are prepared to act upon with precision rather than simply with volume. This conflict, however, is not confined to military bases, bunkers, and missile exchanges between armed forces. Its most profound and most widely felt impacts are being registered in the economic lives of ordinary people from Texas to Toronto, from London to Mexico City, in ways that are beginning to generate the kind of domestic political pressure that no elected government can comfortably ignore. In its first 100 hours alone, the conflict imposed an estimated $37 billion in direct economic costs on the American economy, a figure that encompasses the combination of energy, price shocks, supply chain disruptions, emergency military expenditure, and the financial market volatility that accompanies any major escalation in a region that sits at the center of global energy infrastructure. Gas prices across the United States have risen to an 18-month high, and President Trump, who built a significant portion of his political brand on the promise to end foreign wars and bring American resources home, now finds his approval ratings tied to a conflict that polling consistently shows the majority of the American public does not believe is theirs to fight or their resources to spend. The economic shockwaves from this conflict are genuinely global in their reach, and nowhere is that more visible than in the business community of the United Arab Emirates, a key American strategic partner in the commercial and financial hub of the Gulf region, which has moved from private concern to open public criticism of how the conflict is being managed. Because the United Arab Emirates markets are bleeding in direct proportion to the regional instability and the financial stability of a country that has spent decades building itself into one of the world's premier investment destinations, is now under direct and immediate threat. When Iran targets American military assets in the region, the financial fallout hits Dubai's stock exchange with a speed and severity that rivals its impact in New York, because the global economy is built on interconnections that do not recognize the difference between a country that is formally at war and one that is simply in the neighborhood of the fighting. Iran has long held the strategic option of closing the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow maritime choke point through which approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply passes every day, representing a volume of energy that no alternative routing can replace at comparable speed or cost. And while Tehran's military has clarified that its current targeting policy will be limited to Israeli and American vessels rather than all commercial traffic, the damage to global energy markets has already been done through a mechanism that requires no actual closure to be effective. The uncertainty itself has become the weapon, because insurance rates for tankers transiting the Gulf have increased to levels that make many voyages economically unviable. Shipping companies are making the commercial calculation that the risk premium is too high to justify transit, and the mere credible threat of targeting has been sufficient to strangle the flow of oil and liquefied natural gas through the most strategically critical waterway in the global energy system, sending energy prices into a volatile upward spiral that is showing up in heating bills in Canada, transportation costs across Europe, and manufacturing input costs in Japan and South Korea, countries that had no voice in the decisions that created this conflict and no mechanism to avoid paying its economic price. The web of the conflict continues to expand in ways that are adding new layers of complexity to an already extraordinarily complicated strategic situation. In northern Israel, Hezbollah has resumed sustained rocket attacks that have wounded at least 8 Israeli soldiers, including in a development that speaks to how thoroughly this conflict has reached into the personal lives of Israel's decision-making class. The son of a senior Israeli government minister, a detail that illustrates with uncomfortable clarity that war has arrived at the doorsteps of the very people who bear responsibility for the decisions that shaped its trajectory. Meanwhile, a chilling new intelligence dimension has entered the conflict, with reporting from the Washington Post citing American officials who claim that Russia is now actively providing intelligence support to Iran in the form of targeting data, satellite imagery of American and Israeli military positions, and strategic advice on how to most effectively strike American assets in the region, a development that has raised alarms across Western capitals. And that was underscored by a direct phone call between Vladimir Putin and the Iranian president that has left Western intelligence agencies attempting to assess whether the world is witnessing the formalization of a Russia-Iran strategic alliance that would represent a qualitative escalation of the conflict's geopolitical stakes. In Tehran, there are reports that a new supreme leader has been selected, but that his identity is being maintained as a state secret. And the logic behind that decision, however brutal in its implications, is strategically coherent in the context of a conflict where Iran has watched what precision targeting can do to fixed and identified leadership infrastructure. Announcing a supreme leader publicly gives America and Israel a name to target and potentially a location to track. So the leadership structure continues to govern from the shadows, using the same logic of deliberate invisibility that has kept Netanyahu alive in the sky above Israel. A strange and telling symmetry in which the leaders of two countries locked in existential conflict have both reached the same conclusion about the safest way to survive it. So where does all of this leave us, and what is the honest assessment of where this conflict is heading? We have the Prime Minister of America's closest regional ally conducting the governance of a nation at war from the cabin of an aircraft, his capital city, under a relentless and sustained missile campaign that has degraded the defense systems protecting it and forced his government to admit publicly that it can no longer guarantee civilian warning times adequate for meaningful shelter response. We have the United States, the world's sole remaining superpower, the country that has underwritten the security architecture of the Middle East for 4 decades, watching its billion-dollar defensive systems dismantled by precision Iranian strikes, its economy absorbing tens of billions in conflict-related costs, and its domestic political consensus on Middle East engagement fracturing under the pressure of a conflict the public did not ask for and does not enthusiastically support. We have global energy markets in a state of sustained volatility, driven by the closure or threatened closure of the most critical maritime corridor in the global energy system. And we have the shadow of a broader conflict, one potentially involving a nuclear-armed Russia and a more formal alliance with Iran, looming over every diplomatic calculation being made in Washington, London, Brussels, and Beijing. This conflict, which ignited in the ancient lands of the Middle East, has become something that no single government, no single military alliance, and no single diplomatic framework is currently equipped to contain. A pressure cooker for the entire planet, in which the kinetic reality of missiles and sirens in Tel Aviv and Tehran is being translated through the invisible mechanisms of global energy markets, insurance pricing, and supply chain disruption, into the quiet and creeping economic pressure that is raising the cost of everything for everyone, and making the future feel measurably less certain for billions of people who have never met a decision maker and never will. As the leaders remain hidden, one in the sky, one in the shadows, the rest of the world is left to absorb the consequences of their decisions and to wonder, with increasing urgency, what comes next. That is all for today on Daily Reports. Stay informed, stay ahead, and we will see you in the next update. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching.